With the now release of the PTR for Season 2 for patch 11.1, players are of course flooding in the test servers to test out all of the changes for 11.1, the change to the specs, the balance tuning, as well as the new tier sets, of course, the new juicy trinkets and special effects even on weapons now. Well, there has been something of a spooky idea coming for the next season, which is looking, of course, at the current season of Mythic Plus and trying to think about what's gonna happen next season based on the power of the specs that are meta right now, based on the changes, right? Because, of course, if you see, for example, as we see here, Protection Paladin being far more popular than Brewmaster Monk, then for next season, if you want to see Brewmaster Monk being the meta tank, well, one or two things, or better yet, both things need to happen at the same time. Paladin needs to be nerfed and Brewmaster Monk needs to become more powerful. Otherwise, how can you expect anything to change? And that's where players are getting a little bit worried when looking at the changes for the next season. Because, for example, starting with Paladin itself, currently the meta tank in Mythic Plus, if you look at the changes coming for Paladin at the very least up to now, you have the changes to Holy Paladin, so doesn't really matter. You have the changes to Red Paladin, so also doesn't really matter. You have the changes to the general tree of Paladin, which is rather inconsequential. The only change happening to Protection Paladin is a change to one talent of one of your hero talents being Templar, which is also rather irrelevant because Paladins play only, at this point after being buffed 74 times, play with Linesmith. So there are no nerfs coming in the next season for Prot Paladin. The only thing that is changing, which is also changing for everyone else, is gonna be the tier set. You're losing this current tier set, the 3% flat DR, 10% damage to Shield of the Righteous, and roughly a 15-ish% damage increase every time you use Avenging Wrath. Now, the new tier set isn't even that bad, and if anything, it's definitely not going to make you be any weaker than what you have now. This new tier set for Prot Paladin, you still can get a 15% damage increase for about 20 seconds when you extend it with Shield of the Righteous. The only downside is that you don't get to proc it all the times when you use wings, which is always good to pile damage increases on top of each other. This one is RNG, but it does proc slightly faster than how often you use wings. This one procs once per minute. You use wings every 80 to 90 seconds, so this should be active more often. It also does have slightly more synergy with Prot Paladin, because with the 4-piece you're going to be refunding 1 to 3, so an entire Shield of the Righteous can be fully refunded, so you can cast it again and again. This is very good for the synergy of Prot, because Prot does have benefits in spamming Holy Power abilities. You can get the CDR of your Ardent Defender and Divine Shield reduced, and you can get the CDR of your Avenging Wrath and Guardian of Ancient Kings reduced by getting free Holy Power spenders, so it's also good for that. In general, basically, Prot Paladin is not getting nerfed in Season 2. So, how can we expect to see anything different coming from other tanks if the situation doesn't really change that much for Prot? The situation on the first eye test can seem completely different for Discipline, because unlike Prot Paladin receiving 0 changes, Discipline does receive a whole lot of changes. However, not really enough of these changes can lead to Discipline Priest looking that much weaker in the next season. That's because some of the powerful things that very often players pair together Discipline and Protection Paladin with, they match together very well, because Prot Paladin has a very good spread of defensive they can use. They can cycle through Ardent Defender or Guardian of the Ancient Kings, or their own Divine Shield. They can even use Avenging Wrath as an actual, defensive. And then in between the cracks, in between the gaps of defensive, they can just have the external of the Discipline Priest, the double charges of Pain Suppression. Then Discipline Priest also matches well because they have PI. There is a spec that scales very well with haste, right? Enhancement Shaman, and then Discipline Priest can also bring you more damage as a spec. They have the highest damage out of all of the healers. Those were the things that made Discipline Priest quite valuable as a combo, as a meta partner of Protection Paladin in Mythic Plus. Now, this is not really changing in 11.1, despite the quite hefty addition to Discipline, or removal of things from Discipline, because, for example, Discipline is losing Rapture, which is quite powerful in Mythic Plus as an absorb shield to prevent one-shots and just focus on a single player by just reusing power shields, for example. This is now gone. You're also losing a lot of uptime on your Mindbender, because now you lose the ability to reduce the cooldown of Mindbender with Smite. Even if the cooldown reduction now is increased, you're still gonna get a 20-ish, 20+-ish second cooldown extra on your Mindbender that will be active less often. So it is hurtful for Discipline Priest, just like the loss of Rapture is hurtful for Discipline Priest. But in general, the feel is that this is not enough to make them that much weaker in Mythic Plus. So now you already have your tank healer combo, which is not actually being affected that much in the changes of Season 2. So now you have to move to the DPS. Now the DPS work and exist on a slightly different value than the tank and the healer, because when you're looking for a meta tank, it's not that you're saying the tankiest tank that takes the least damage is the one that is meta, or for healers, the healer that can heal the most is the healer that is meta. That's obviously not true. It's not been very often true. Right now, for example, you could argue Prot Warrior is tankier than Protection Paladin. You could argue that a slew of healers, Preservation Evoker, Mystery Monk, even Resto Shaman, can all heal more than Discipline in Mythic Plus. So it's not really the case for the tank and the healer to be the best at what they are supposed to be doing is what makes them meta. However, for the DPS, very often it's a very simple, are you doing top damage, then you are in contention for being a meta spec. You know, even right now, for example, 2 of the 3 overall better performing specs in Mythic Plus are Frost DK and Enhancement Shaman, which are also currently the meta specs in the very high keys in Mythic Plus. So for DPS, it's going to be much closer when it comes to balancing, when it comes to the tuning, for example, of very powerful trinkets, which can shape the power, shape the value of certain specs, things like DPS trinkets, even the new Prester Diamond Jewel Ring that can be very powerful for mastery specs. You can have weapons. There are going to be some special effect weapons that can be very powerful that might give power boosts to certain specs depending on their timings of their cooldowns. If they are 1 minute cooldown specs, 90-second cooldown specs, 2 minute cooldown specs, depending on how well they will synergize with both the changes, the balance tuning, as well as the new gear available in Season 2. Even if we look at right now, the currently popular specs right now, starting with Frost DK. Well, Frost DK is not actually getting any damage changes. It is being nerfed for being too tanky. They are losing 8% stamina from Veteran of the Third Ward. They are losing 3% magical damage reduction from Null Magic, and they are losing 10% of their Absorb Shield of Thermofrost. Both Frost and Unholy are being nerfed, but not really in terms of damage. Yes, again, they are swapping their tier set away, but considering the power level of the old tier set and the new power level of this tier set, we're not talking about massively game-changing tier sets. We're not talking about, you know, back in the days of Shadowlands where you had 2 entire specs being meta entirely because of how powerful, how brokenly powerful their tier set was. Like, for example, Destruction and Survival in Shadowlands. This is not really the case in this expansion, really. So, Frost DK is currently doing top damage. Frost DK has been doing top damage ever since week 1 of the expansion. You can go over to week 7, you can go over to week 11, you can go over to week 13, and even week 16 and week 17. Frost DK has always been in the top 5, top 6 of damage dealers. So with no changes to their damage, it is also, you know, unlikely to expect them to be doing that much worse, at least in terms of output in Mythic Plus. Now, where we have our real first question mark on are they going to be meta next season, because clearly it's not for Prot Paladin, very likely not for Discipline Priest, and also likely not for Frost DK. Where we have more of a contention is for Enhancement, because while we mentioned the changes to Discipline, they looked big, but they didn't really change that much of their power in Mythic Plus. When it comes to Enhancement, they actually did receive a significantly larger amount of changes. So Blizzard has pointed out, we have went over this, they wanted to reduce the power they had with their Maelstrom spenders, as well as the power they could gain from their Feral Spirits, and the stacking of the damage of their Elemental Spirits talent, which is what is also being nerfed, in exchange for massively increasing the base damage of all of their abilities. Practically, they basically just doubled most of their abilities damage. So we will have to see. This is more of a tinkering with numbers and see what the effect of this is in general. Enhancement Shaman was admittedly overperforming. They had not only did they scale extremely well, but as mentioned, the Feral Spirits paired together with Witch Doctor's Ancestry for even further CDR, paired together with Elemental Spirits for even more stacking damage every time you would summon the spirits, paired together finally with their tier set, which also gave them an extra Feral Spirit on creation of the Feral Spirits themselves, created all this piling up and multiplying damage stacked on top of each other, which is what made them super powerful. Now, a lot of it is going away. You're losing the tier set that gives you the extra Feral Spirit. You're getting your Elemental Spirits nerfed. Now, they also count physical damage, but the damage increase is only 10% instead of 20%, so it's a significant change there as well. So we have yet to see in general what is going to be the result of all of these changes for enhancement. But if there was to be a question mark on whether or not their damage will go lower, enhancement is definitely the spec right now that can lose a lot of damage. Admittedly, enhancement has also been quite far ahead of everyone else by quite a lot, so I would even say ballpark number, even if enhancement was to lose 10% of their damage next season, they will actually still remain one of the best specs in Mythic Plus anyways. That's their current power level, so that's our first possible spec that might lose a lot coming into Season 2. The last one is Augmentation. At this point, we have to talk about this wretched hive of scum and villainy every time we talk about Mythic Plus, Augmentation Evoker. And this time around, we have another question mark that will put us in front of the question, is this going to be enough to make Augmentation Evoker weaker? Now, historically, at this point, we have asked ourselves this question like 7 times, and every time the answer was no lemao, and Augmentation continued to be super popular in Mythic Plus. Now we're getting, again, another attempt. You are getting Ebon Might and Breath of Eons to be, again, 25% more powerful outside of the raid, so more stats, more burst damage to all of your DPS in Mythic Plus. The downside is that now Ebon Might, so primary stat, no longer can go to tanks and healers. One of the major complaints about the power of Evoker was it can make tanks stronger. They give them more primary stat. More primary stat can make tank parry more, block more, absorb more. They can have stronger effects on some of their abilities with more primary stat, as well as, of course, doing more damage. Healers are the same. You can get a healer to go through, to survive through dangerous healing checks because they have basically a trinket active while they are healing, thanks to Ebon Might giving them several thousand primary stat, right? Now, this is gone. So now, if we really thought the power of Evoker wasn't giving more damage to the other DPS, but rather helping you survive, then this part now is gone. Yes, you still have things like Prescience that can give crit to a tank or a healer. You still have possibly your mastery, your versatility that can go to a tank and a healer sometimes. You might also have still, of course, the extra armor with your scales. You still have things like rescue or things like source of magic or other tools of the Evoker class in general, but as a role, as a spec, Augmentation has lost the major tool that gave you power outside of just the DPS. So now we will have the crossroads. Was Aug powerful also or mostly because it powered up tank and healers in Mythic Plus, allowing them to survive situations that specs and comps without an Augmentation wouldn't have been able to? Or is it still the same because the damage increase it gives now with the buffed Ebon Might and the buffed Breath of Eons to only DPS specs is still going to be a way too powerful for another normal DPS to compete with something like this? As I said, historically the question has been no, it's not enough to make Augmentation weaker. But again, we persevere and we ask the question again. Definitely, if we have to look at the current meta lineup coming into Season 2, they have the question mark next to them together with Enhancement. Frost DK is not really losing damage, Prot Paladin is practically untouched, and most of the disc changes are not too negative or too terribly bad when it comes to Mythic Plus. So you can expect these to remain at a similar power level and these two to be a bit more finicky in how they will end up after these changes in Season 2. Now, obviously, this doesn't mean these specs are going to remain where they are, because there is, of course, the other side of the coin, which is, sure, Prot Paladin is not being changed, but what if another spec is being buffed, as we mentioned at the beginning with Brewmaster Monk. You know, maybe Prot Paladin isn't being changed, but perhaps we have enough changes to other specs to make them powerful enough to compete with Prot Paladin. Well, admittedly, Prot Paladin is a bad example because right now there is no other tank that is being buffed nearly high enough to compete with Prot Paladin. The only cope angle right now is Guardian. Guardian, on top of quite a few of the positive changes to the general tree of Druid, you also have quite a few good changes to Guardian, like finally getting a pseudo magic damage reduction back with Ursul's Wording, giving you back a good amount of magical damage reduction, as well as a flat-out buffed Frenzied Regen. There have been a few buffs to Guardian Druid. Again, I don't think it's going to be enough still to compete with Protection Paladin, but it's definitely on the rise compared to where they are now. However, that's going to be the point. We have seen now the expected changes of the current meta specs in Mythic Plus, and none of these, especially for the first 3, but possibly likely even for the next 2, won't even be enough to make them drop off by themselves. They need an extra push. They need the extra shove of another spec being buffed significantly that can start matching them. For example, we have the full rework of a marksmanship and a few other changes as well to BM and to survival. We also had other changes going the way of warriors as well, arms and fury. Fire mage is also getting changed quite a bit. So that's the other question. Not just how or if these meta specs are being touched, mostly nerfed is what we're interested in, of course. If they are meta, what we want to see is not them getting stronger, if anything is getting them weaker, but also how are the other specs becoming stronger in order to combat, in order to compete with these specs. As I said, at the moment we're sort of on the bleak side, especially the combo of tank and healer receiving not that many changes is probably the more worrying one when looking at the meta for Season 2. But we will have to now wait and see the following development of the PTR, especially because we can still hope, of course, for more tuning, for more balanced tuning going the way of, you know, week after week we have more than a month and a half even for more possible changes in the PTR for multiple specs. So that's also something we can expect and we can hope for as we get close to the release of Season 2. But for today, we can say this is the current outlook on what we can expect when it comes to the meta of Season 2 when it comes to Mythic Plus. At least looking at the changes of the current meta specs in Mythic Plus, how likely they are to continue to remain at the same level of power in Season 2. So, of course, pending and expecting any further changes, for today on this Wednesday, we can stop right here. We're starting as usual, of course, the goodbyes by thanking everyone for having watched the video, together with everyone else who has been supporting completely for free. Now, with this out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, I knew it was bad. I forgot to change light pants, light socks. I'm freezing right now.